October 14th, 1939, 00:58 hours. Scapa Flow, the Royal Navy's main anchorage in the Orkney Islands. Supposedly the most secure fleet base in Britain. HMS Royal Oak, a battleship laid down in 1914 and carrying guns designed before the first air raid of the Great War had even happened, sits at anchor, believing herself safe behind block ships, anti-submarine nets, and shallow water that no submarine commander in his right mind would attempt to navigate. German submarine U-47, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Günther Prien, has just done exactly that anyway, threading a narrow, poorly blocked channel called Kirk Sound that the Admiralty itself considered nearly impassable, and lined up a torpedo shot on a battleship 25 years old that nobody in the fleet believed could still be a target worth attacking inside its own harbour. In the next 13 minutes, Royal Oak will capsize and sink with 833 of her crew still aboard, in a raid so audacious that Winston Churchill would later call it one of the most brilliant operations of the entire war, carried out not by a modern warship, but by a single submarine, slipping past a barrier the Royal Navy had trusted for a generation. This is the story of the night Britain's most secure harbour turned out not to be secure at all, and the antique battleship that paid for finding that out. By 1939, Scapa Flow had been the Royal Navy's principal northern anchorage since the First World War, protected by a series of sunken block ships deliberately scuttled in the narrower channels leading into the anchorage to prevent exactly the kind of submarine infiltration the Admiralty feared most. Kirk Sound, one of several eastern approaches, was considered blocked by 3 such wrecks positioned decades earlier, along with strong tidal currents that made the passage treacherous, even for a small vessel attempting it on the surface. Naval planners had judged the eastern channels sufficiently obstructed that active anti-submarine patrols they were considered a lower priority than the harbour's main western entrances, an assumption that had held since 1914 without a single successful penetration. Royal Oak herself, though old by the standards of 1939's newer fast battleships, still carried 8 15-inch guns capable of devastating any surface target she could bring them to bear on, and her presence at Scapa was intended precisely as the kind of secure, out-of-the-fighting posting appropriate for a ship of her age, away from the front lines where faster, more modern capital ships were expected to do the dangerous work. Prien's mission looked close to suicidal by any conventional assessment of the target. Scapa Flow was defended by multiple block ships, minefields in the wider approaches, coastal artillery, and the presumed vigilance of an entire fleet anchorage. And Kirk Sound specifically had been chosen as a blocked channel, precisely because naval architects on both sides considered it unnavigable by a submarine of U-47 size, without running aground or fouling her propellers on the sunken wrecks themselves. German naval intelligence had studied aerial reconnaissance photographs of the block ships for months beforehand, identifying a narrow, only partially obstructed gap between 2 of the wrecks that conventional wisdom had overlooked, precisely because it required threading, a passage most planners assumed didn't functionally exist. Prien would have to navigate that gap on the surface, at night, in strong currents, with no margin for the kind of course correction that daylight or open water would have allowed. And if a patrol vessel or a searchlight caught him mid-passage, there would be nowhere in the narrow channel to dive or turn back. U-47 made her approach on the surface after dark on October 13th, running on diesel engines through Kirk Sound's gap between the block ships, with barely feet of clearance on either side, scraping bottom at least once in the shallow, fast-moving water, before finally breaking through into the anchorage itself, just after midnight. Once inside, Prien found the anchorage nearly empty, compared to what German intelligence had led him to expect with much of the home fleet's main strength having already moved south. But Royal Oak remained at anchor, unmistakably a battleship and a legitimate high-value target, regardless of her age. Prien's first spread of torpedoes, fired from close range in the dark, achieved only a single hit that Royal Oak's crew initially misread as an internal explosion or accident rather than an attack. Since the idea of a submarine successfully penetrating Scapa Flow was considered close to impossible by everyone aboard. That misreading cost the ship what should have been her best chance to prepare for a second strike. If you're finding this dive into Royal Navy history interesting, subscribing helps the channel keep telling these stories. Given nearly 20 minutes by the confusion aboard Royal Oak, U-47 repositioned and fired a second spread of 3 torpedoes, all of which struck home along the battleship's hull in rapid succession. The damage was catastrophic and immediate. Royal Oak began listing within minutes, the flooding overwhelming compartments faster than any damage control effort could contain, and the old battleship rolled over and sank in a total of 13 minutes from the first confirmed hit, taking 833 of her crew down with her, many trapped below decks with no time to reach the upper deck before she capsized entirely. U-47 slipped back out through Kirk Sound the way she had come, again on the surface, again threading the same narrow gap in the block ships, and returned safely to Germany, where Prien was personally decorated by Adolf Hitler and became one of the earliest celebrated U-boat commanders of the war. His crew paraded through Berlin as propaganda proof that no British anchorage was truly safe from the Kriegsmarine. The immediate consequence for the Royal Navy was less about the loss of one aging battleship and more about what her sinking proved regarding Scapa Flow itself. Within days, the entire fleet was temporarily relocated away from the anchorage, while emergency additional block ships, new anti-submarine booms, and reinforced defences were rushed into place at every approach channel, work that continued for months and fundamentally altered how the Royal Navy thought about the safety of its own home waters for the remainder of the war. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, later wrote that the raid demonstrated a degree of daring and skill that deserved recognition, even from the enemy who had suffered because of it, and Scapa Flow's defences were rebuilt to a standard that made any repeat of Prien's exact route permanently impossible. The wrecks and barriers added in the aftermath still visible in the Sound today. Royal Oak was never meant to be anyone's last stand. She was a quarter-century-old battleship, parked at what the entire Royal Navy believed was the single safest anchorage in the country, doing exactly the kind of low-risk duty appropriate to a ship her age, while faster, newer capital ships did the fighting elsewhere. What sank her wasn't a failure of her own guns or her own crew, but a single submarine commander willing to thread a channel that generations of naval planners had already decided didn't need watching. The Royal Navy had trusted Kirk Sound's block ships for 25 years, without a single test. It took Günther Prien one night to prove that trust had quietly expired, long before anyone thought to check.